Right, welcome everyone. Well done. Last session on Friday. You're clinging on. Um, my name's Gillian Georgiou. I am the RE Adviser in the Diocese of Lincoln. But in this particular conversation, I'm wearing a different hat. I was one of the project team leaders for the Religion and Worldviews project, and Stephen was my boss. So I shall hand over to Stephen to introduce himself.
Yeah, the idea of bossing you in any way is crazy. Yeah, so I'm Stephen Pett. I'm one of the advisors at RE Stay, and I was the project lead for the RE Council's Religion and Worldviews project, working with Trevor Cooling, who is project director. So,
So if it's all right, I'll kick us off, Stephen. What we're here to talk about really is the document that was at the heart of that project, which was the handbook that was produced for curriculum writers, for syllabus writers as well. So could you get us rolling by just telling us a little bit more about how the first version of that handbook actually came about? You know, where did it come from? What was it for? What were your hopes for it?
yeah, thanks, Gillian. So, I mean, I guess most people here will know a lot of the background to this project, in that in 2018, the RE Council's independent commission produced this report, Religion and Worldviews: A Way Forward, and that set a lot of conversations going. The RE Council carried on with the work from that and put together, commissioned a disciplinary review. So some academics, Tim Hutchings and Rachel Shillito and Celine Benoit, were asked to do a disciplinary review and check how the term worldviews is used in various disciplines. And that that booklet was published in 2020, and it's really helpful survey and clearing of the ground really to think about how diverse the uses of the term are. That year as well, a group of academics, mainly academics, because I was involved and I'm not one, but the academics, proper academics with qualifications and professorships and that sort of thing, again in a whole range of disciplines, met together. It was going to be, a couple of day conference, but actually it ended up being 6 sessions over a couple of weeks online. And that was to explore again more to going on from the disciplinary review to say, well, what are the potential benefits of an approach that uses the idea of religion and worldviews, and what are the challenges, and how might it be a fruitful way forward for the subject? Where its roots, where are the roots? Are we just stepping away completely from the history of RE and the approaches? Or is it actually fruitful? And the idea seemed to be that yes, it was fruitful. And then the discussions were published. Amira Tarani wrote them up as discussion papers. And that was published. And again, that's a really helpful document. But the overriding response to the academics who were there was, okay, this all sounds fine, but what is it actually going to look like in the classroom? How do you actually develop a curriculum based on it? So those 2 projects had happened, and then the RE Council got more funding to try and do something. Said, let's see what it actually looks like, how we actually transform it into a curriculum. And that project, various people bid to be part of that and to run that, and RE Stay, and the bid we put in won that one. And that's at the beginning of that particular 3-year project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really clear, wasn't it, that things did need to move forward, and that if you discuss a particular approach in a group of academics, forgive me, academics in the room, if you do this, you'll probably come out with 65 different solutions from 12 people. So that scoping was really, really super important to lay the groundwork. But the bottom line is teachers in classrooms that need to have some sense of what it's going to look like. So within that sort of groundwork laying, what were your hopes for the handbook that you are actually going to produce?
I think that I mean it was daunting. It was a daunting prospect because, of course, a lot of people have been thinking about the future of RE, and people have written a lot about in response to the commission report.
Yeah.
There was hostility as well as sort of warm welcomes, and so the idea was trying to make sense of all that and draw it together to listen to the people who were involved in this and to try to draw their ideas together in a way that does exactly what you're saying, Gillian, which is to translate the perhaps high-level academic thinking into stuff that will work in the world of the classroom teacher. Now, the draft handbook that came out after the first year of the project was not written for the classroom teacher directly. It was written for the curriculum developer. So that might be a subject leader, but it's more likely to be a MAT subject leader or a SACRE agreed syllabus conference that we're using that. So that was the sort of audience for it. So there's a different level of expectation, if you like, in terms of what is written. But the idea was to try and draw stuff together to set out the national statement of entitlement that would effectively it's not quite a consultation because this was a project. The RE Council had done a consultation, and we were trying to take the vision of that the commission forward. So, but when we produced the draft handbook, it was out there for people to comment on, and we did receive, lots of comments. But part of that process was having a group of individuals from the world of RE. I mean, I spoke to lots of people, but there's a particular group, and in the handbook itself, actually, I'll put the link to that in the chat. But in the handbook itself, I credit some of the people I spoke to, but particularly the people who are involved more closely in that program. And they so that was the point of that draft handbook, was to listen to lots of people, get lots of comments, lots of suggestions, and try to draw out the vision, I suppose, in a practical way.
And obviously within that draft handbook, we had a sort of initial iteration of what was called a statement of entitlement. Notice my sort of preposition there, a statement of entitlement. Talk me through that. What was the point of that?
Well, there was a statement of entitlement that was in the commission report itself, but reading it and talking to people, it felt like it was not as clear as it needed to be in order to be usable in the classroom, to cover not only the idea of content, but sort of pedagogy as well. And so that was the first thing to try and do, to have some sort of clarity on that. And so, I mean, people who've read it will know that we've got these three elements to it, which were to do with dealing with content, and then how you engage with that content, and to remember the people doing the engaging, which are teachers and pupils particularly. And so that was to try to set out that terrain, if you like.
Yeah.
And talking to lots of people to try to make that as helpful as possible.
So here we go. $64 million question. Are you ready for it? How do you characterize, author of the Handbook of Curriculum Guidance, how do you characterize a religion and worldviews approach?
I think that I think a religion and worldview approach particularly opens up the subject, in that traditionally we spend a lot of time thinking about sort of orthodoxy, orthopraxy. Our teaching in RE often would start from a theological starting point. It would be some sense that there's some expected behavior, some expected beliefs on the part of a committed adherent, which is, fine. It's fine because there are traditions, there are orthodoxies and orthopraxies, and there are a lot of committed adherents. But it only gives part of the picture, and the religion and worldviews approach allows us to sort of ask the question, what is the relationship between the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy, and then what actually happens in people's lives? So I think it's Nancy Ammerman who talks about the difference between professional adherence and the ordinary people. And it was about, I know we've been referring to that, but perhaps not as transparently and deliberately as we could have done. And so that was I think that's what religion and worldview approach does. So it's open, it's allowing us to be more open about what the knowledge is that pupils are gaining, where it comes from, how we can check it, who we should, what sort of, I mean, this is an Ofsted word now from Richard Quay, what warrant descriptions and conclusions have. But it's involving them in the process of engaging with the content. And that includes thinking about the teachers' involvement as well, and what impact they have in the selection and delivery and presentation of content as well.
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Nikki, who was one of the other project team leaders, often talks about the fact that because of her own personal experiences, personal worldview, the curriculum, she writes, would be absolutely full of feminists if she could. But being reflexive about, you know, how the content is being selected, who it's being selected by, being more critically aware of that. I absolutely agree. I think that's a key part of how this approach moves us on from the way perhaps that we've taught RE in the past. Yeah, definitely.
And I think for Nikki as well, there was that sense that when she first encountered the curriculum in the school she moved to, it was full of dead white men. And so she was self-consciously making it more alive and more diverse. Yeah. And then looking at it again and realizing that she'd gone for a particular worldview, really, in terms of feminist perspectives. And so then stepping back and going, oh, right. So it's another realization of how the impact of the teacher and the curriculum developer. And this is one of the strands in the statement of entitlement, which is about power and influence. And that's us trying to think about, well, given that if we're developing a curriculum, we're in a position of power and influence. And so how are we using that, and how can we justify the choices that we're making? I mean, it's incredibly complex, isn't it? So, I mean, Gillian, then you had your task as one of those 3 teams who were selected by out of about 10 or 11 that applied to try and exemplify this and what it would look like in particular contexts. You were part of one of those teams. And so that's what you had. You were given the draft handbook and said, here you are. How would you apply this? I mean, that was part of a testing process for the handbook as well. If it was rubbish and didn't work, then we needed to find out, and so we could change it. But you were given that, and what did you make of it, and what did you do?
I mean, it was such an exciting opportunity, actually, because all of the conversation about how the subject might develop, what difference that might make for pupils, what difference it might make for teachers, it felt like a really exciting moment. But there's no one sitting there with something going, and here you go, this is what it looks like. So the opportunity to be right at the cutting edge of that was a real privilege. The handbook, I think, was an incredibly important starting point for us, because it encapsulated all of that research, all of that listening, all of that conversation that you were talking about that led from the commission to the drafting of the handbook. You know, it was all held within that document, and included a wider range of research and different perspectives within that. I think what we then needed to do was to take that and think, how is that going to fit in our context? So there were 3 project teams. I think I had the hardest job. The other 2 will probably disagree with me. There was one team looking at using the handbook to design an all-through curriculum for a multi-academy trust. That was Nikki McGee's team. And then Jen Jenkins led a group of teachers who were developing a syllabus for a local authority and diocese. So being really clear there, the distinction between a syllabus and a curriculum as well, that's quite important. I had a bag of cats, a lovely, wonderful bag of cats, but we were a group of teachers from all across the country, primary, secondary, single form entry, mixed age, mixed phase classes, different geographic locations, different levels of expertise. We had leaders, teachers, teaching assistants, and because we were located in different areas of the country, we were all of us working with different legal requirements. So what we were really trying to test was whether the handbook could help us devise a way for us to move towards a religion and worldviews approach in all of those different contexts. So it was less about starting from ground zero and building something new, and it was more about us starting with what we already had and moving it towards a religion and worldviews approach. And would the handbook help us in that process? I think a lot of the sort of research overview that was contained in the beginning bit of that handbook was really helpful from a professional development point of view. It sent us off in lots of different directions as a team. So we did a much broader sort of literature review on the back of what we'd read in the handbook to help us really define how we might shape something that would help teachers develop what they already had towards a religion and worldviews approach. But for us, I think a really key element of it was that draft national statement of entitlement. None of us are neutral. We're all coming from our own perspectives, educationally, professionally, and so on. And we have within our project team, I can see several members here. Kate and Georgina were part of our team. And Kate came already doing quite a lot of work in this area and thinking quite a lot about the work of Klafki, and that was quite influential as well. So we sort of brought what was in the handbook together with what we also had mulling over in our own professional backgrounds and used that to develop a framework that really was underpinned by two key principles. So our first principle, thinking about curriculum design, thinking about how you might adapt, even at the level of an individual unit of study, you need to come at it from the approach that worldview start with people. So either people as objects of study in the classroom, or people as interpreters of the world around us. So we're not sort of anti-critical realist approach, you know, we're very much supporting the idea that there are ontological realities that could be explored in the RE classroom, big, meaty, abstract concepts like justice or truth or God, but it's people who are doing that job. It's people who are trying to investigate those things and ask questions about those things. So that handbook helped formulate that and solidify that idea in our minds. Worldviews start with people. And then the second key principle was that pupils' ability to make sense of what they learn is an integral part of the curriculum. And that's both in terms of how they are supported, really intentionally supported, to understand what kinds of scholarly questions to ask and what kinds of scholarly tools to use, but also how through their learning they are able to be more critically aware of their own positionality, their own worldviews. I can't overstate here the influence of the work done by Kate and Lynn Ravel as well. They will recognise this as I'm talking, but it was the sort of research overview within the handbook, the National Statement of Entitlement, that really helped solidify that approach for us. So that led us to developing a framework teachers could use to almost audit their current curriculum or individual units of study and think about what adaptations they might need to make to bring it towards a religion and worldviews approach.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. And this is one of those things about, I mean, you downplay the literature review that you all did, because I know that your bag of cats is an extremely able bag of cats, and you read so much stuff, and then you drew that, and to boil it down, to distill it into those principles, which, you know, teachers can pick up and think, oh, I understand that, I can see what to do, which is, I mean, that's a brilliant move from, you know, from the density of it and the complexity into those two simple statements. But I mean, that also, I think, might suggest, I know we're going to do people's questions later, but Harriet asked a question about how do you address, if you're following a local syllabus, how do you then apply a religion and worldviews approach? And one of them is through your framework. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But I think you asked me the $1 million question about how do you characterize the religion and worldviews approach, and so I'm going to ping that back at you. I mean, we already see something of it through those two principles, but I wonder if you want to just expand that a little bit. Well, how do you characterize religion worldviews approach?
Thanks for asking me, Stephen. I'm so pleased. Okay, so I think if I were to try to think about where we've come from and where we are heading, I would want the children to be engaging much more sharply with the actual tangible lived reality. So there is a tendency, I think, to plan an RE unit of study that starts with quite abstract concepts and beliefs. So we'll do the creation story and we'll find out what that means about God. And then at the other end of the unit, we'll hear about a person who comes from this community, and we'll find out what they're doing because of this story. I think a very simple win here for a religion and worldviews approach is to flip it. Start with the person. Here's a person. Let's look at what they are doing. Why are they doing that? Let's find out more. And by engaging with their important stories, sources of authority, ways of living, ways of thinking about the world, to actually better understand their worldview. I think that tangibility element is really, really important. David Lewin's work around sort of pedagogical reduction, not trying to teach too much content, but instead selecting exemplary content, examples of case studies, for example, as a way into exploring a worldview, the concepts that underpin it, what it looks like lived out in the real world. I think that's a key feature of this approach. And then I think crucial to support the children and the young people to engage with that content using various different ways of knowing. It goes beyond labeling up key features of a mosque, or even just looking at different types of mosque. It's actually quite rigorous scholarly questions. And I would suggest that a religion and worldviews approach works really well when we think first about how we want the children to know before we think about what we want them to know. Our teacher framework actually has a series of questions encouraging the teacher to think about how they want to know before we ask them to address questions about content. Because if, let's say, my topic is places of worship, if I want my children to know about that through asking theological questions to draw out people's key beliefs through that study, or if I want my children to know about how this building is used by different people and why it is here, and whether it was here 100 years ago or whatever it might be, my way of knowing fundamentally changes the content I might put in front of those children. So I think the religion and worldviews approach is quite radical insofar as it makes us address that question first, rather than an add-on after we've written out our reams and reams of content that we need to cover. And then because of that, because you're taking that approach, I think it opens up the space for children to become much more critically aware of their own positionality, their own worldviews, the ways in which they shape how they engage in the world, their ways of believing, their ways of living, their ways of thinking. I think it draws attention to some of the assumptions they might have, and it doesn't judge them, but it just says, oh, look, have you noticed? And that is really, really helpful then. Sort of looking beyond the RE classroom, it becomes part of a broader ethical conversation, really, about what it means to be human in a sort of global, diverse context.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, I think one of the key things that seems to come across from your that answer and from your framework as well is about how the shift from what we might say as a textbook RE approach, as in here's the RE textbook and there's the content that we want to transmit to children in lots of engaging and exciting ways because there's brilliant stuff in that textbook. That's one approach to very contextual. This is not a set of abstract beliefs or abstract actions or stories. This is actually, what these are real people in this particular place, and with all the stories that are associated with that. So it's not and because you're starting with people, you draw in some of those wider stories, but you place them, and then you can decide whether those are representative of other people in other places or not, and how you might find that out as well. So it's the sort of intentional placing. I think that's one of those key features that's of the approach and of the way your framework works. And I mean, this is, in one sense, this isn't new. I can see Kate Christopher on my screen. I know because she was working with us at RE today, and that was one of, Kate, I mean, this is one of your arguments right from those years ago as well, wasn't it? This sort of contextual RE, and not just you. I know other people were writing about this as well.
Yeah, I think the tangibility is absolutely key. And I think even from a practical sense, there are opportunities to identify case studies that could be revisited multiple times through a curriculum. So you're cutting down on planning and resourcing, but you can use that particular case study in different kinds of ways to address different kinds of content or different ways of knowing. But you can also broaden things out. It's not that we're going to limit the kids to learning about this one person and nobody else. There are ways you can broaden their understanding out as well. So obviously, as a writer, it's terrifying when you put something out into the real world and people get to read it. And even worse for you, because there were people who were literally employed to take it and use it and see if it worked. So we all went off and we did our thing. And we then had various meetings with you to talk about how it was progressing. How did that process help you actually redraft, revise the handbook that we now have published?
Well, it's great working with brilliant people who do a lot of hard work and thinking. And I mean, the teams, because you were trying it out and because you were working with teachers in real places, then there's really concrete advice and suggestions that come back. But also, there were other people who just gave feedback anyway and comments on different parts of the handbook, and sort of have to listen to all of that. But we also engage scholars to look at particular things as well. So I want to pay public acknowledgement and gratitude to Kevin O'Grady for his brilliant book on original worldviews, but also for the work that he did in giving us a review of that draft handbook. And I'm really indebted to him for his clear thinking and his suggestions and his advice. And I mean, he will be able to read through some of where his words to us made a material difference to the handbook. But also Tim Hutchings and David Lewin and Martha Shaw gave particular feedback on the statement of entitlement, and then they couldn't resist give comments about the rest of it as well. And again, all of that was really helpful because again, those three scholars, three different perspectives looking at particularly the statement of entitlement, and that was really helpful because in fact one of us that statement of entitlement was too much to do with personal worldviews, and another one said this is too much to do with organized worldviews. And so I felt a little bit like the BBC, if you're being told off by both sides, then maybe you're somewhere in the middle and doing okay.
Yeah.
But so it was really so the statement of entitlement, there were a few little tweaks to that. That if you really wanted to, you could look at the first version, the second version, but essentially that stayed pretty much the same. The rest of the stuff, it was a question of deciding we've got so many different audiences. Let's be explicit about that and say, let's actually, perhaps unusual in a single document, let's write different sections for different audiences. And so there are three main sections. One is a sort of general overview for the people who are not really versed in this. There's a section B, which is about those who know a bit about this, but I want to try and put it into practice, put it in place. And then there's a third section, which is a sort of, I have to admit, not a very high level academic presentation, but it is to do with the sort of geeky background, rationale and that sort of thing. So the handbook was, deliberate. That was the key change for us, is to rearrange that to make it appropriate for different audiences.
I think that was the thing, because we were doing this project, working with the draft version, and constantly in fear that you would really radically change what was in the handbook, so that by the time it was published, the work we did looked completely disconnected from the handbook that had been finalized and sort of signed off. But actually, it was just structural changing. It wasn't changed significantly in substance. And I think the structural changes that have been made make it more accessible, which was, some of the feedback that you'd been getting anyway, I think was targeting it more clearly at the different groups of stakeholders. Yeah.
I think you're all extremely honest and thoughtful people, and if there had been real problems with it, we would have made the change, and then would have just had to work out how that ran out in the frameworks. Because if it had been wrong, there was no point in pursuing it. So I'm really pleased that it wasn't pulled apart.
Yeah. So what next? I mean, we've done it. Is that it? Do we ignore it and do something else now? What's the plan?
I mean, you're right. Once you write something, you put it out there. It's you no longer have control over it and how people use it and understand it. And of course, I mean, I'm hoping that academic research that's done will respond to this stage now, rather than just keep going back to the Commission report. There's a lot of analysis of the Commission report, and I'm hoping that this will be the next step in this sort of ongoing discussion and debate, and that people will make improvements to this and refine it and make it so that it works. But I'd like people to look at the handbook as major next step, and your frameworks as well as exemplifications of that, as that next stage, rather than just thinking, well, I understand the religion worldviews approach and without having read it. I mean, I think it tries to draw together sort of current thinking. And where it's lacking, I know that people will point that out, and there should be papers that come out that point out all the holes, if you like. But I think it's definitely part of an ongoing discussion, and then people have to try and apply it. And I know that it's a challenge to write your framework. I know for Jen Jenkins, it was a challenge to write the syllabus. I'm currently writing a syllabus for a local authority and who want a religion worldviews approach, and I wrote that handbook. I'm still finding it really hard to put a syllabus and therefore think about a curriculum. Finding it really hard to put it together. So this is by no means the last word.
No, I agree. It's completely a step on the journey. Really, really important step. And I would really hope that anyone who is involved in either syllabus writing, curriculum designing, or even that teacher who is working with what they've got and they'd like to play around with what it might look for that to move towards a religion and worldviews approach, I'd really, really strongly encourage them to immerse themselves in the handbook. And I mean, there's so much stuff out there to make it more accessible. There's little video summaries of sections. And I think the exemplification from the different project teams is actually really helpful. I don't think any of those frameworks were written to be oh, you can have this now, off you pop, we've done the job for you. It wasn't about that. It was about the process of how we got from A to B and how that might support other syllabus writers, curriculum developers around the country to do the same thing. Thank you so much, Stephen. We've got 10 minutes. I've been desperately noting down questions in the chat as we go. I haven't quite managed to get Kate. So if I start at the top, if that's okay. There's one question here that I think we can deal with quite quickly. We can respond quite quickly about the curriculum for Wales. And I think, well, I don't know whether did you have any people applying from within that context to do this piece of work, Stephen?
I
don't know. No, I'm not sure. I think because the project teams that were, I mean, it was an open application process, but the project teams that applied, I think, were largely coming from the English context. Having done quite a bit of work recently with colleagues in Wales, I think there are probably aspects of the teacher-led framework that could be applied across to the Welsh context. I don't know whether the Coventry one and the Inspiration Trust one would work in the same kind of a way, because you have that different approach to curriculum in Wales, but still definitely worth engaging with the handbook, I think, because there is lots in there that is also relevant to the Welsh context. I mean, even at the level of, the concept of Cynefin and that sense of location, positionality, personal worldviews, that's really integral to the curriculum for Wales. So definitely worth engaging with that, I think. The next question I pulled out is how a child's experience, their personal experience of religion or of their own worldview, what place does that have within a religion and worldviews approach? So can I ask you, Stephen, to respond to that one?
Yes, I think, I mean, you've mentioned this, that the being intentional about acknowledging and identifying people's own position, and of course those are changing, aren't they? And particularly from young children, but pretty much all the way through, just like probably ours are as well. But trying to draw attention to that and think about, well, where are you standing at the moment in relation to this? I mean, one of the strategies we recommend is the sort of mixing desk idea, which is an acknowledgement that people's responses and views change depending on the context you're in, and also depending on what circumstances you face as well. Because at one point in your life, you might be adamant about this, and then something else happens, and you change your views. So, so there are opportunities that, I mean, I think it's still a challenge to think about that. I mean, the work that Jenkins has done in her framework, which draws on the work from Jonathan Doney and Rob Freethy and others in their book on metacognition, where they've got this sort of personal worldview passport kind of set of questions. That's really helpful starting point. But I think they recognise in that book that it's a starting point, and there's work to do on it. So, I mean, the handbook's got some suggestions about things that you can do to alert pupils to their position, but that's an area that I think we could be much more precise, perhaps, and more sophisticated about as we go on.
Yeah, I was earlier this afternoon in Emma Salter's session on personal knowledge in RE, and that was a really helpful review of what the scope of that looks like right now in the English context. I think in the context of our teacher-led framework, the fact that our starting point was that worldviews start with people means that sort of acknowledgement that we are all of us positioned is the very starting point of the learning. And I know a lot of schools have taken that by using either real case studies, sort of historical or fictionalized case studies, or they've sort of hung the learning on, if you like, an imagined child whose lived experience is rooted in real life. And in some of these schools, they are using that same child throughout the whole curriculum, and they are noting points of resonance. And I think resonance is really key here. They're noting points of resonance between that child's lived experience and the pupil's lived experience in order to facilitate that kind of self-reflexivity that we're looking for in the pupils. Not to expose pupils, not to make them feel as though they have to share, and certainly not to get them to sort of critically analyze their own worldview in a way that somehow diminishes their worldview. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about putting a child under a spotlight and saying, you're the Muslim, you're the expert, tell us. It's not that. It is just helping children understand that they don't come from nowhere, that they live in a time and a place, that they have a particular understanding of the world, a particular set of beliefs, a view on big things like justice and God and so on and so forth, love, and that part of the RE curriculum is helping them explore that more deeply. I think that's really integral to this approach. Thank you. A couple of other things on here. This is one that exercises me quite a lot in my day job. What happens if you've got a locally agreed syllabus that makes it really flipping hard to do this in the classroom? Right, okay. Do you want to have a crack at that one, Stephen? And then I'll put my Thrupney worth in.
I mean, I think that we can do it within a lesson. We can have an approach within a lesson. If we've got some, a question or some content that's prescribed, if you like, we can approach it in a religion and worldviews way by thinking about how we're going to engage with it, at being open about the choices that we're making. So, I mean, I would say applying your framework questions is a way of doing that. That's explicitly what your framework is trying to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a religion and worldviews approach is not driven by content. It's why we talk about an approach. So there are implications around the subject matter we put in front of the children in the classroom, there's probably a greater emphasis on trying to present the children with real, tangible, lived examples of whatever it is we're teaching about. But I think there are also pedagogical implications, a much greater emphasis on interpretation, a much greater emphasis on analysis, a much greater emphasis on reflexivity. And I think you can take all of those pedagogical approaches no matter what content you are being asked to teach by a particular locally agreed syllabus. I would say one potential barrier for some schools in some areas is where a locally agreed syllabus might be very prescriptive about content and there's a lot of it. I think it then becomes harder to actually implement this approach, because what this approach needs is it needs space. Needs space for a child to really go quite deeply into the content that you are asking them to engage with. So whether that is addressing that content by using scholarly questions and methods, or whether it is about asking the child to reflect on how that content relates to their own personal worldview, that stuff needs time, it needs space. So where you have a syllabus that's very prescriptive in terms of substantive knowledge, content, coverage, it can become trickier, but not impossible. And the really helpful thing, I think, about the frameworks is that you get an example, particularly in our one, you get an example of what that might look like in practice, because we did have teachers working with locally agreed syllabuses within our group. I have picked up 2 more things here. I may have missed some. Thank you for that clarification, by the way, about the Welsh context. That's really helpful. Thank you. I might only have time for one. There was a question about the National Statement of Entitlement. To what extent could it unify the RE community? Just an observation that that National Statement of Entitlement made it into the National Content Standard, which was published in September 23. And the National Content Standard, I think, waves the flag for one of the only documents in my living history where the majority of RE-related organisations have actually said, yeah, we support this. So I do think it has potential to become that unifying point, yeah.
And I also think that I would urge you not to see philosophy, sociology, theology as the lenses through which you look at this. I mean, I think that you would see the lived experience is one part of that engagement strand, one part of that engagement element of the statement of entitlement. And the ways of knowing includes, of course, a range of maybe disciplinary, but other tools and methods and ways of looking, really, as well as ways of knowing. And that can include philosophical analysis. And then the dialogue interpretation. There's really strongly the sense there that you look at the orthodox theology and the texts and whatever to see how people engaged with those through decades, millennia. And so there's a real potential theological emphasis there, but we're not trying to stick in those, perhaps, we're not trying to stay within those 3 disciplinary areas for that.
I think it makes the learning experience richer to help children understand that people actually live this stuff. You know, we know contextually within this community that, you know, the majority of our kids in classrooms, the majority of our teachers are not necessarily living religious worldviews. So to make it real, but to take seriously the ontological concepts, the theological questions, the philosophical questions, that is absolutely integral to this approach. It just adds in something that perhaps was previously missing, where we were taking more generalized presentations of what it might look like in practice. So it's sharpening that bit, which was a little weaker previously. I think it's really important to emphasize that. And then just finally, a couple of questions around non-specialists. Kate's going to jump right down my throat on this one, because we have a habit, I think, of talking about non-specialists when we talk about teachers of RE who do not have RE-related qualifications. And she quite rightly points out that even people who have RE-related qualifications are not experts in every aspect of RE. So teachers with other specialisms, the twos, I think it is possible for teachers with other specialisms to teach RE really well. And I also think that this handbook and the way in which it might shape RE syllabuses and curriculum, and some of the exemplification of that is already out there, is really, really helpful in supporting those teachers with other specialisms to have a sense of what it would look like in practice. Right, we've got about 20 seconds left.
I think one thing is the question about how complex this is. I think that is a challenge. But our RE's always been quite complex, hasn't it? And we shouldn't be put off making a move like this because it's complex. And the challenge for us is to find ways to simple ways to get people to apply these sorts of approaches within wider RE. So I think the comment there, yeah. But I mean, so yes, it's Benjamin Beasley there as well as saying, but so there's the challenge, but also it's very appealing. I mean, I think it is. I think it is a rich development in RE.
100%. Thank you so much, everyone. Go and have your dinner. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you all bright and early tomorrow morning. Thank you.